Test, test, test. Test. Should I get started? All right. Hello, my name's Ken Westin. This is actually the second time I've presented at GrrCON. I presented in 2016. I think this time I'm actually a lot more hungover than last time. Had a lot of fun last night. So I'm going to be talking about some really interesting things that I found. I was doing a lot of research. I used to work at a company called Splunk, where I was doing a lot of data analytics. Now I work at Elastic. But I'm really interested in how data is used for conducting investigations. And I'm finding that a lot of times the investigations aren't always just going to be limited to cyber. So a lot of like the SIM types of use cases, basic correlation alerts, firewalls, things like that. That's one side of it, but as you start to actually look at some of these criminal investigations, there's a lot of other data sources that need to be utilized. When I was actually doing research, I was actually digging into a lot of like dark websites, looking at a lot of the marketplaces. At that time, I was doing a lot of research around stolen credit cards and things like that were happening in retail. But I started noticing something in these forums was that there was this sort of rise of Bitcoin and cryptocurrency. And what was really interesting is that financial folks became really interested in cryptocurrency. So it wasn't just something that, the techies were using. And I also started seeing that there were conversations that were actually happening in some of these forums where people were actually looking for insider information. So things like earnings reports, so someone who's a trader, they could actually use that information to make a profit. And I started thinking about this, like that's really a smart way to make a lot of money. So there's maybe two takeaways from this talk. So if you're on the criminal side, you're going to learn techniques and how not to get caught. If you're on the defensive side, you're going to learn hopefully about the value of some of this data and how you may want to go about protecting it, right? So a little bit about me. I've been doing security for a while. 2016, I presented around some things that I was doing. I actually had a startup where I was actually tracking criminals, stolen laptops, phones, things like that. Ended up unveiling organized crime rings, helped solve a carjacking. Ended up also building a tool that would actually mine EXIF data out of images that you could search. So I was finding stolen cameras, all sorts of other things like that. I'm really interested in insider threat hunting. Again, more on the data analytics side. So why this topic? I just think it's really interesting. It has the criminal hacking element to it. There's also like fraud. You start getting into dark nets. You look at some of the cryptocurrency that's being used for some of the trading that's actually happening between the hackers and the criminals. And I think this is actually a significant threat to the economy. I'm going to walk through a number of these cases where these folks have actually been caught. I was actually able to go through some of the criminal complaints and sort of identify how they went about and actually did their actions. But I believe that this is actually happening a lot more. People are a lot smarter. You'll find that a lot of times when people do get caught doing this, it's because they do something stupid. I think I have a slide around this, but it's around usually the criminals. They either become arrogant or greedy or a combination of the two, and that's what usually gets them caught. You'll find that some of these criminals were actually doing this work for 5 years. And they wouldn't have gotten caught except for maybe one of the hackers got greedy and they tried to do something else, and they got busted for another crime, and then it unveiled a number of their other illicit activities. Let's get through that one. So looking at some of these darknets, it was really interesting. There was like this sort of insider trading social network. Do you have non-public information? Publicly traded companies, apply now and monetize your inside information. There's a number of these forums where they will ask you for insider data in order to actually get inside of that forum and be part of that group. So you actually have to commit a crime to actually be part of this particular group. They'll have information that has to be publicly traded, like on the NASDAQ. Some of these folks, they'll give you a percentage of whatever the trader actually makes off of that, and they'll usually give that to you in the form of cryptocurrency. So what I found really interesting too is that in these forums, there was people that were not just, selling hacking services, things like that, but these folks really knew finance. They really understood this quite a bit. Some of these folks, you'll even see that in one case, it was actually a former VP of Morgan Stanley was involved in some of these. So it's just a really interesting thing where you have people that have sort of the white collar crime element, and then you also have people that are have the hacking element. And when you start to merge those two in these sort of forums, it gets pretty dangerous. This is one I've actually found too on the darknet. It was one of the groups. You have to commit a crime to get access to it. I have a feeling actually that this is actually the FBI. Actually, it's a honeypot. Just the way things were worded, it was almost too professional, a little too polished. But there was a number of these. If you look on, in Tor and darknets and things like that, you'll find a number of these different forums. And there are also maybe a section like in some of the traditional hacking forums. You'll go in there and you'll find that there is a section for insider trading as well. So it is interesting is that, finance folks, they really got into trading cryptocurrency themselves. Not only trading stocks, but, Bitcoin, people can make a fast buck off of it, right? So they're aware of it. They have Bitcoin. So they know how to provide, give Bitcoin to someone else as well. And it's not necessarily something my parents could do, right? But some of the finance guys, they figured it out pretty easily. So the definition of insider trading, with the illegal practice of trading on the stock exchange to one's advantage through having access to confidential information. What's interesting is that when you actually look at the SEC, this was the original definition of insider trading. What's really interesting is that in order to actually be tried for insider trading, you have to actually have a fiduciary duty to that company. Does a hacker who actually goes out and steals information from you, do they have a fiduciary duty? No. Right? So that's actually what happened with a particular case that actually changed the definition. There was a guy named GrrCON. He's Ukrainian. You'll see a lot of these guys actually operate out of Ukraine. Probably not surprised. But this guy, he figured this out. He didn't go to someone else to trade for him. He did the trade himself. But he wasn't very smart about how he did it. He ended up taking about $42,000 to invest in the stock market. He's never invested in stock in his entire life. And all of a sudden he goes out, and this is basically a 1 year's salary. So he goes and he puts 1 year's salary directly into the stock market, and he puts it on one particular stock. He was able to net almost $300,000 as a result of that. He didn't get that money though. Because when this actually happened, that threw up all sorts of red flags with the trading company that he was using, and they reported that directly to the SEC. He never actually showed up in court, but the FBI basically just took the money from his account, so he never actually got it. What he was actually doing was he actually found a vulnerability in the Thomson Financial server, where another company, they upload their earnings reports to this particular server. So he found the vulnerability, and he was waiting for the presentation material to appear. And as soon as it did, he had insider information. He knew what their earnings were going to be, and it was his company IMS Health Incorporated, and that's the single stock that he actually traded on. So as a result of this and some other cases like this, the SEC actually, they changed the definition of insider trading. Oh, he also had his IP address as well. So he had a summary judgment. He had to pay back the money as well as interest. They just took it directly from his account. So he did not owe a fiduciary duty to the source of the information. So he actually didn't get tried for insider trading, right? So he wouldn't have to get any jail time. He just had to forfeit the currency. They redefined that and they actually included this type of an attack as insider trading. They kind of refer to this as outsider trading. Not very creative, I guess, but as a result of that, they did modify some of those rules. So this is a really interesting case. It actually involved a number of hackers as well as a lot of traders. There was this guy, Vadim Ermilovich. I'm going to totally brutalize all these names. I apologize. And also another guy named Alexander Eremenko. Now, Alexander, he's famous for another reason, and I'll talk about that when we get through this case. He got really greedy. They started with targeting PR firms. They wanted to go after these systems. They figured they could, harvest the press releases for earnings reports, and then they could share that with traders. And there was around 35 different entities in the trading side that got busted. 35, and so a lot of these were shell companies that were created, or a number of other investors, and you'll find that these investors were actually very smart. One of them was actually a former VP at Morgan Stanley, so he knew how to stay under the radar for the SEC. He started doing smaller transactions, and he had a number of different accounts, maybe 35,000 here, 35,000 there. So that was actually allowed them to avoid detection by the SEC. And they would have gotten away with it too. If it wasn't for one of the hackers, he got greedy, and he started getting involved in some stolen credit cards. And the Ukrainian police actually went to his house. They grabbed his laptop, and that's when they found all of the evidence of what they were actually doing on that particular laptop. So again, if they would not have gotten caught. This was going on for almost 4 or 5 years, right? But because of that one mistake that hacker made, the criminal hacker, they got in trouble. So what they did was, the first thing they targeted was Market Wired. They did a SQL injection. They got reverse shell, and they accessed internal login credentials. This one was really easy for them to do. There was also a challenge here is when the FBI was actually conducting the investigation, they didn't have any logs. So that was a bit of a challenge for them. And it was actually the data they actually got from the laptop that actually served to incriminate the criminal hackers versus any sort of logs that this particular company provided. They had no idea that they were compromised. They stole around 100,000 press releases. So that's what almost frustrates me. So someone got into this server and they were downloading over 100,000 press releases, and you had no way to detect that. So what they would do is they uploaded these. They actually created a hidden service through Tor, and they actually started advertising this service to traders. To get access to these press releases, it only costs you $10,000 in Bitcoin. That's a pretty good deal, especially when you can make millions off these types of transactions. And they ended up getting into a couple of traders, and they decided to do business with them. They then went after some other newswires. They went after PR Newswire. This one, they actually went in multiple times, and they got detected. They got booted out, and then finally, they actually went out and they bought a bunch of passwords from a compromised social media network. They basically did a brute force looking at employees, right? Because employees never have the same password for Facebook and their admin credentials on the enterprise, right? That's how they were able to get in, again, and they stayed there. That time they didn't have to use any malware. They did install some malware initially, that got detected, and then they got booted out. Then they went after another one with a business wire. They started actually getting kind of famous in some of these underground forums. And one guy actually said, hey, I actually have access to this PR Newswire. How about I don't want to get involved in this trading stuff. How about if I just sell you the access? So they actually bought access to this other PR network. The traders were smart. They actually created several brokerage accounts. They also set up certain shadow businesses and other entities. And so they had a lot of these different accounts where they were actually doing the trading. They ended up making, in total, over $100 million, right? I mean, forget all the other types of cybercrime. This is where the money's at, right? Just imagine how much money that they are able to make off of this. And again, they would not have gotten caught if one of the hackers didn't get involved in some other criminal enterprises. They also found, when they were conducting the investigation, when they were looking at all the logs, they actually found that some of the hackers actually were given direct trading accounts as well. So the traders actually created accounts for them so that they could actually, as payment, right? So you actually log into this account, here's the information, and then you can transfer it to your bank. And they actually found that some of the IP addresses actually match where the hackers were logging into PR Newswire. It also matched as the IP address of when they were logging into some of the brokerage accounts as well. Use a proxy. So here's an example. So they executed over 800 trades, and it was based on earnings. So just to give you an example on Caterpillar, you'll see that their trades were fairly small. So that's one way of actually avoiding getting flagged by the SEC. And again, they did this over a long period of time. But the one group they actually made just off Caterpillar alone over $700,000, right? One of the guys that was actually organized this was this guy, Vitaly Korchevsky. He actually said he was innocent. He's also a pastor at a church. He was the former VP. He was a VP at Morgan Stanley as well. So he's really the mastermind behind a lot of the trading aspects of it. Again, avoiding the SEC. And he said he was innocent. He was just recently sentenced to 5 years in prison. They were going to give him more, like 8 or 9 years, but because he was a pastor and he does good things for the community, they gave him a more lenient sentence. And he also had to forfeit all the money that he actually made, around $17.5 million. And there was a lot of people that actually came to his defense. A lot of people from his congregation actually came to his trial. So if you're going to commit a crime, especially white-collar crime, and you want to get a lenient sentence, become a pastor. So the data sources here, it's online brokerage, web server accounts, getting application logs. So I just think this is really interesting where a lot of times when you're collecting logs from your infrastructure, it may not be for investigation you're doing internally. It could be something a year or two down the road where, the FBI comes knocking on your door and do you guys have logs from like 2 years ago? Can we get access to that? Especially if you're dealing with financial services and things like that. They had access to bank records, a lot of the business registry data, the Newswire authentication VPN logs, and of course the forensic images of Ermlovich's computer, which was provided by law enforcement in the Ukraine. What was really funny too is that they actually did find like a tutorial video on his laptop as well, showing the traders how to download the illegal information. So if you are going to commit a crime like this, again, don't leave a video of how you actually commit the crime on your laptop. Some of the tools and exploits, there were compromised credentials. There were some challenges with this. I mean, if you had that multi-factor authentication, it would have blocked it. But these were, this is probably 5-6 years ago. There was some malware, a lot of SQL injection, and of course using Tor and proxies. There was actually one of the hackers too. His name was Alexander Eremenko. He was part of the PR scheme as well. He got a little greedy. And he decided, who has access to a lot of this insider information as well? The SEC. So he actually sent out phishing emails. It was malware-ridden PDF documents to SEC employees. And he was able to compromise systems. He got access to it. It was a test database called Edgar, the Edgar database, where companies actually upload information to the SEC around acquisitions and things like that. And then he ended up sharing that information with another group of traders, a separate group, and he got 50% of the profits as a result of that. This was actually from the FBI, just kind of showing how it all kind of flowed. Eremenko provided the data to one particular person, and then from there they spread it out amongst a lot of other traders and some other trading groups. So this is what some of their transactions look like. They actually looked at what each one of these individuals or these groups, how much did they usually win. And all of a sudden, when they started doing this the SEC data, what was their win-to-loss ratio as well. So again, this is something that would raise a red flag. If all of a sudden you're making a bunch of money, when you weren't doing that before, it's going to raise some red flags. Their total profit, these guys are small time compared to the PR group. They only made $4 million. right? Yeah, there was a number of different traders that were part of this, and they got, some of them are in jail. Another target is going to be legal firms. There was a case where there was a guy named Yin Hong, Bo Zheng, and Hong Chin. They are Chinese folks. They actually had a PowerPoint presentation where they actually walked through their entire business plan of how they're going to be conducting this particular business, that when they got their computers seized, it was still on there. So again, if you're going to be committing crimes, don't make a business plan. They actually had a PowerPoint. They also had a number of emails. So first thing they targeted was one organization. They were using primarily phishing emails, kind of related to the last two talks. And then they were able to get some information around it. What they were actually looking for was acquisition information. So if you know that one company's going to buy another one, you can trade on that information, and you can make quite a bit of money, obviously. Then they targeted another law firm. What's interesting is the law firm, they were kept their names out of the criminal complaints. So that was good. If you're a law firm, I guess you can do that. In May 15th, there was one, Pitney Bowes acquisition of a company called Border Free. They had traded on that information. They made around $3 million doing this, right? So again, these guys are small time. They're not like the $100 million ones, right? Only $3 million. This is how much they made in their trades. So they made around $500,000 each. They also charged them on interest and the penalty, and then they gave them a total. And you'll see here, there's this one lady, Su Cheng Lai, that she didn't actually get any interest. She had to give the money back. She's actually the mother of one of the criminals. She thought her son was just a really smart trader, right? And, he gave her all this money as a result of all this, and then she had to give it back. So, sorry, Mom. Another one, financial services, there was a group called Fin4. There were about 100 companies targeted. They were actually looking for pharma companies. So they were looking for companies that maybe have drugs, things like that are actually going to go to market. The SEC actually requested logs and data from 8 different companies. They didn't even know they were compromised. Right. So this was a really good investigation, actually. FireEye did it. There's a bunch of research and some white papers on it. And we already talked about that one. So one thing, too, is monitoring of traders. I found that when they're trading, they do a lot of monitoring. They'll monitor everything from Skype. There's logs. Everyone that they're talking to, some of them aren't allowed to use their cell phones during trading hours, things like that. But what happens when they go home? Right? There's no way to really track them at all times. There was actually one group this is another interesting case. A guy named Daniel Rivas. He worked for Bank of America. He worked in IT. He had access to a database, and this database had information around pending acquisitions. He didn't want to trade on this information himself, but his girlfriend, her father, was a trader. So what he would do is he would write these sort of love letters. They look like love letters, handwritten. He would give them to his girlfriend, and then it was a code, it had dates, it had the stock, when to buy it, and then she would give that to her father. So pretty smart. So that's one way not to get caught, right? There's no digital trail. Probably would have gotten away with it. Except that trader, James Moody, he started sharing some of the information with another one of his friends who was also trading. And then Daniel Rivas had a buddy that was actually getting into some financial difficulties. So he decided to help him out. And then another friend also wanted to help out, get access to this information as well. Then they used a time bomb type of application. They thought it was secure, but the problem is if you delete, you delete it, but the other person doesn't delete it, you still have that message. And they didn't delete some of these messages, and they were able to get compromised as a result of that. So these guys, I'm not sure if they actually did jail time, but they did have to pay significant fines. So what kind of information is going to be targeted? If you look at it, it's going to be things like your earnings reports, any sort of patent information. So think about like your legal services, M&A activity, your FDA status. I even think vulnerabilities. If you identify a vulnerability, maybe in like some sort of web application or a mobile application of a major company, and you know it's going to have an impact on the stock, you know that could be considered insider information as well. Or even a breach. If you know that the particular your company has been compromised and it's going to be in the press, Equifax, right? You can get into some trouble with that. There was a really interesting case with Equifax where a bunch of people called into question why was the CEO and some of the other executives selling stock, you know, just before the announcement of the breach. And they didn't get in trouble because it was scheduled, right? This was something they already had in place before. It was this sort of scheduled thing where they sell it. Except one guy that was actually, who was not sure if he was directly the CTO, but he worked in IT. He found out about the breach and he went and he sold all of his stock, right? And he ended up getting busted as a result of that, right? So there's some ways to mitigate that if you are doing this, the schedule type of thing. I would say also in industrial IoT, like looking things like manufacturing yields, if you get any sort of intellectual property or formulas, you know, different types of organizations are going to be targeted. A lot of times it's not going to be the company itself. It's going to be your service providers. So think about where do you put your earnings reports when you're doing you know, your PR releases? Does your PR firm actually secure that data? How do they go about doing that? It's maybe time to start considering doing assessments for those types of companies. Law firms as well. A lot of times I've actually found the law firms are not very good at data security as much as they should be, especially smaller firms. It could even be like a real estate firm as well. So I would even look at things like investor relations portals that are third-party services, your factories. I could even think that, you know, in security, security within a company, and that organization would also have access to some of this information. So it needs to be handled sensitively. So thinking about too, how do we mitigate some of this? So at least we need to start logging things, you know, monitoring our endpoints, much more verbose logging, especially if we have applications. So if we have like, you know, like some of these PR firms are using for their earnings reports, the presentation types of things, having really verbose logging, especially around authentication, is going to be critical for that. A lot of organizations don't have any sort of DLP, like your data loss prevention. That's going to be helpful, especially for some of the sensitive types of data. You know, getting access to your proxy, your firewall. User behavior analytics is becoming much more popular, especially for monitoring for insider threats. We are not really relying on signature-based detections. You're looking more for anomalies. You know, if all of a sudden Susan accesses this one directory that she usually doesn't go to, or this one particular server, that would be an anomaly and something that I wouldn't want to be alerted on. And I also think it's time to do assessments of our partners, especially our legal and PR firms. You know, doing exercises, tabletop exercises around some of this as well. So I'll give you guys time to write all these down. No, I'll share the slides with you, but just kind of examples of some of the technical data sources as well as non-technical data sources that you want to consider bringing in into your environment to monitor for this type of behavior. I do a lot of workshops around insider threat. This was actually a device from the FBI. He was the CTO of the FBI at the time. He gave a talk at Black Hat, and this is actually how they think about doing insider investigations on their own agents. Right, so it's usually not something that I'm just going to steal this information. It's usually there's indicators before that. I kind of refer to them as human indicators of compromise. Right, so if someone is having financial difficulties, a lot of times if someone's going through a divorce, things like that, they're more likely to commit these types of acts. It doesn't mean that everyone in your company that's getting divorced, you got to like start watching them. No, that's not the case. But you have to realize that it does increase the risk of that, or at least have confidential reporting. Like if someone overhears someone having a conversation, or if all of a sudden Joe in IT drives up in a Ferrari, right, that might be an indicator as well. So that's on the kind of on the non-technical indicator side. And it's usually when you start to look at login detection, that's when we start leveraging technology to do that before they actually cause damage or exfiltrate data from an organization. And I'm sorry I went a little fast on this, but if you guys have any questions, ideas, or stock tips, here's my my contact information. And I'll open it up if there's any questions. Any questions? Yeah, in the back. Where can you learn more? I'll give you back my slides and the notes. I have a bunch of links to a bunch of the cases as well. Some of the actual criminal complaints, they're really fun to read, actually. I like going through those. So I'll share that with you guys when as soon as I get back to my hotel room. Yep. Any other questions? All right, so if you guys are going to be doing this type of act, don't get caught, okay? All right.